He thought the darkest betrayal in marriage was infidelity, but nothing could prepare him for the day he found out his wife was carrying another man's child, and that man was his own father. What happened next would spiral into a story of obsession, revenge, and an unthinkable crime that left an entire community stunned. This is not just about a broken marriage, it is about a broken bloodline. Welcome to Dark Motives, where we uncover the most shocking and disturbing true crime stories. If you are new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, because every day we bring you cases that will leave you questioning just how far people can go when lies, betrayal, and obsession take control. Today's story is one you will not forget. It is about a man who discovered that his wife's pregnancy was not a blessing, but a curse that carried the blood of his own father. What followed was a chain of events that tore a family apart, ended a life, and left an entire town struggling to make sense of the horror. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. I always love seeing the community from all around the world come together to share their thoughts on these unbelievable cases. Now, let's begin at the very start, with what looked like a perfect family on the outside, but behind closed doors a storm was already building. Our story begins in a quiet corner of Springfield, Missouri, a town known for its calm neighborhoods, family values, and churches that stood as the center of community life. To the outside world, Daniel Miller and his wife Rebecca seemed like the picture of stability. Daniel worked long hours as a mechanic, known for his reliability and strong work ethic, while Rebecca was the caring wife who kept their modest home warm and welcoming. Daniel grew up in that same town, raised by his father, Charles Miller, a stern but respected figure in the community. Charles was a retired military man, strict with his principles, and someone who held authority even long after leaving service. He was admired by neighbors, though Daniel had always known him as a man who demanded respect above all else. For years, Daniel believed he had built the life most men dreamed of: a steady job, a beautiful wife, and the hope of starting a family. Friends often said Rebecca had a glow about her, and Daniel felt proud whenever she walked into a room beside him. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect life, whispers and doubts were beginning to stir, small cracks forming in a marriage that everyone else thought was unshakable. It started with little things. Rebecca seemed distracted, distant at times, her smile not reaching her eyes. Phone calls she would take in another room, sudden trips to visit her in-laws that Daniel was never invited to, and excuses that never quite added up. Daniel brushed it off at first, convincing himself that stress or loneliness was getting to her. But soon, the feeling became impossible to ignore. Something was happening in his own home, something that would soon push him to uncover a truth darker than he could ever imagine. The first real sign came one late evening when Daniel returned home earlier than expected. He walked through the door and found Rebecca quickly hanging up the phone, her face pale as though she had been caught doing something she should not. When he asked who it was, she gave a short answer, claiming it was a friend from church. But Daniel could hear the faint tremble in her voice, and it planted a seed of doubt that refused to leave his mind. As the weeks passed, that seed grew into something much darker. Rebecca had become secretive, leaving the house without explanation, sometimes late at night, other times in the middle of the day when Daniel was at work. She claimed she was visiting her mother, yet whenever Daniel tried to call, no one answered. Each unanswered ring deepened the pit in his stomach, making him wonder just how much of his life with her was built on lies. The tension grew heavier when Rebecca discovered she was pregnant. At first, Daniel was overwhelmed with joy. He had dreamed of becoming a father for years, and the news felt like the blessing he had been waiting for. But almost immediately, Rebecca's reaction struck him as unusual. She did not celebrate the way he expected, and her eyes carried a weight, as if the news had only deepened a secret she could no longer hide. Daniel noticed changes in her routine. She would make sudden trips to his father's house, always with an excuse that never made sense. When he offered to come along, she insisted it was not necessary, brushing him off with a forced smile. It was during these moments that a dangerous thought began to creep into Daniel's mind. Why was she spending so much time with his father, a man she had once described as intimidating and overbearing? He tried to silence those thoughts, telling himself that his wife and his father were simply bonding as family should. But deep down, Daniel knew there was something more sinister at play. Every late-night whisper, every unexplained absence, every strange look between Rebecca and Charles gnawed at his sanity. His suspicions were no longer whispers in the back of his head. They were becoming screams he could not ignore. The breaking point came one afternoon when Daniel decided to leave work early. Something in his gut told him to go home unannounced. As he walked through the front door, he heard voices coming from the kitchen. Rebecca was on the phone, her back turned, her voice low but urgent. Daniel froze, listening. What he heard would change his life forever. Her words cut through him like glass. She whispered about the pregnancy, about how no one could ever know the truth. Then she said the name that made his blood run cold. She said Charles, not Dad, not your father, just Charles. And with that, Daniel understood the betrayal in its rawest form. The child his wife was carrying was not his. It belonged to the one man he trusted the least but still had to call father. For a moment the room seemed to spin. Daniel could barely breathe, his heart pounding so hard he thought it would burst. He staggered back quietly, his hands shaking as rage and disbelief consumed him. This was no ordinary affair. This was a violation of blood, a corruption of family, a wound so deep it would never heal. Later that night, he confronted Rebecca. At first she tried to deny it, swearing that he misunderstood, but Daniel's eyes told her there was no point in lying anymore. Slowly, her face crumbled, and with trembling lips, she admitted the truth. She confessed that the affair had been going on for months, that it started in moments of weakness, and that the child growing inside her belonged not to her husband, but to her father-in-law. The silence that followed was unbearable. Daniel stood there, staring at the woman he had once promised to love forever, and realized she had destroyed not just their marriage, but the very foundation of his family. The betrayal was complete, and in that moment, something inside him snapped. Daniel could not sleep that night. His mind raced, his body trembled with anger, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw Rebecca's face twisted with guilt and his father's name on her lips. By morning, the storm inside him could no longer be contained. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them. He drove to his father's house, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Charles answered the door with his usual calmness, his voice steady, his expression unreadable. But Daniel saw through it now. Behind that mask of discipline and authority was a man who had crossed the ultimate line. "Tell me it isn't true," Daniel said, his voice trembling with fury. Charles did not flinch, he didn't deny it. Instead, he looked his son straight in the eye, a coldness in his gaze, and said, "You were never strong enough for her. She needed a real man." The words cut deeper than any blade. Daniel lunged forward, shoving his father against the wall, his fists shaking as he fought the urge to destroy him right there in his own living room. Years of bottled-up resentment, fear, and obedience to this man exploded all at once. Rebecca appeared moments later, having followed Daniel, her voice breaking as she tried to calm him. But her pleas only fueled the fire. To Daniel, they were no longer his wife and his father. They were conspirators, two people who had stolen his dignity and ripped apart his life. The air was thick with rage, and the fragile line between confrontation and violence was thinning by the second. The confrontation left Daniel shaken to his core. He stormed out of his father's house that day, but the fury inside him did not leave. His mind replayed every memory, every moment when Rebecca had disappeared without reason, every time Charles had looked at him with quiet disdain. Now it all made sense, and the weight of it crushed him. In the days that followed, the betrayal spread like poison through every corner of Daniel's life. He could not look at Rebecca without seeing a stranger. He could not think of his father without feeling a hatred so strong it consumed him. Sleep escaped him, food lost its taste, and every moment alone was a battlefield in his mind. But then, as Daniel started digging deeper, he discovered this was not just a one-time affair. Neighbors had seen Rebecca's car parked outside Charles's house more than once at odd hours. A family friend even admitted, in hushed tones, that they had suspected something long before Daniel did. The truth was, the affair had been a secret hiding in plain sight, and everyone around them had chosen to stay silent. What broke Daniel even more was a letter he stumbled upon while searching Rebecca's belongings. It was handwritten, signed by his father, filled with promises and declarations that went far beyond lust. Charles had told Rebecca he wanted to leave his wife, that he wanted to start over with her, and that their unborn child was proof that their bond was stronger than any marriage vow. For Daniel, it was no longer just betrayal. It was a war being waged against him from within his own bloodline. His father had not only taken his wife but was plotting to take his entire future. And with every new discovery, Daniel's rage grew darker, pushing him closer to a breaking point he would never return from. By now, Daniel's world had completely collapsed. His marriage was a lie. His father was his greatest enemy, and the child his wife carried was a constant reminder of his humiliation. He no longer saw Rebecca as a victim of temptation. He saw her as an accomplice in his father's betrayal. One night, sitting alone in his darkened living room, Daniel stared at the letter he had found. The words blurred in front of him as his hands clenched into fists. His father's promises to Rebecca, the talk of a new life, the plans for the unborn child. It all became too much to bear. He whispered to himself over and over, "They've taken everything from me." That whisper soon became a vow. If his father wanted to take his wife, if Rebecca wanted to destroy their marriage, then Daniel would make sure none of them walked away untouched. His mind twisted around thoughts of revenge, each darker than the last. It wasn't just about anger anymore, it was about reclaiming his pride, proving that he was not the weak man his father claimed he was. Rebecca tried to reach him, begging him to talk, to forgive, but every word only fueled his anger. He could no longer hear her pleas as a wife. He heard them as lies, as excuses from someone who had chosen to stand with his father, instead of with him. He shut her out, his silence louder than any shouting could have been. By the end of that week, Daniel had made up his mind. There would be no reconciliation, no chance to heal the wounds. He was done being the victim. And in his twisted logic, there was only one way left to end the torment that had consumed his life. It was a rainy Saturday evening when Daniel finally reached the edge of no return. The storm outside matched the storm raging within him, thunder rolling through the night as he sat in his truck just a few blocks away from his father's house. For hours, he had wrestled with himself, pacing, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, convincing himself that justice had to be done, even if he had to deliver it with his own hands. When he finally stepped out into the rain, he was no longer the man people in Springfield knew as the hard-working mechanic. He was a man consumed, blinded by betrayal, driven by a fury that demanded blood. He carried with him a hammer from his tool chest, its weight solid in his hands, heavy enough to end everything. Inside the house, Charles was alone. Rebecca had left earlier that evening after yet another argument, leaving the old man sitting in his chair, sipping from a glass of whiskey. He did not expect to see his son walk through the door, soaked from the storm, his face twisted with rage. The confrontation was short, brutal, and final. Words flew at first, insults hurled across the room, but Daniel's rage had already crossed the point of no return. In one violent motion, he raised the hammer, and years of resentment came crashing down. The sound echoed through the house, louder than the storm outside, as Daniel released every ounce of hatred he had stored for the man who had stolen his wife and destroyed his life. When it was over, Charles lay motionless on the floor. The room was silent, except for Daniel's heavy breathing and the pounding of the rain against the windows. He dropped the hammer, his hands trembling, his mind unable to process what he had just done. In that moment, there was no relief, no victory, only the hollow weight of a decision that could never be undone. When the police arrived, the scene was grim. Charles Miller's body lay in the living room, the hammer discarded beside him, the storm still raging outside. Daniel did not run. He sat on the couch, soaked in rain and sweat, staring at the floor as though the life had already drained out of him. When the officers cuffed his hands, he offered no resistance, only silence. Word spread quickly through Springfield. A respected veteran, murdered by his own son. Neighbors whispered in disbelief, unable to grasp how a family so admired could collapse in such a violent and public way. But the truth, once uncovered, left even seasoned investigators shaken. Rebecca was brought in for questioning, and under pressure, she revealed the affair. She admitted that Charles was the father of her unborn child. Court documents later showed that she broke down in tears, confessing to the relationship that had destroyed 2 generations of the same family. It was a revelation that shocked the entire town, a scandal that newspapers called the ultimate betrayal. During the trial, Daniel's defense painted him as a broken man, driven to the edge by unbearable betrayal. His lawyer argued that the crime was not premeditated, but a moment of blind rage fueled by the discovery that his wife was carrying his father's child. But the prosecution painted a darker picture. They said Daniel had planned the murder, that he had carried the hammer with intent, and that nothing could justify taking another man's life, no matter the circumstances. The jury sat in silence as the details unfolded. Letters between Charles and Rebecca were read aloud, each word another twist of the knife. Witnesses testified about the arguments, the suspicions, and the unraveling of the Miller family. And when the verdict came, the weight of it settled over the courtroom like a stone. Daniel Miller was found guilty of second-degree murder, sentenced to decades behind bars. A son condemned for killing his father, a marriage destroyed, and a child born into a world already marked by tragedy. The story of Daniel Miller is not just about a crime. It is about how betrayal within a family can shatter lives in ways that no one can ever fully repair. A wife's secret, a father's selfishness, and a son's rage collided in the most destructive way possible, leaving behind nothing but pain, shame, and questions that will never have clear answers. Rebecca gave birth months later to a child who would never know the man who fathered him, nor the man who killed him. For many in Springfield, the scandal was a wound that refused to heal. Some blamed Rebecca for her betrayal, others blamed Charles for abusing his authority as a father, and some still argue that Daniel, despite his rage, crossed a line he could never come back from. In the end, 3 lives were destroyed, and an entire family was wiped out by a chain of choices that could have been stopped at any point. It is a reminder of how secrets, once buried, always find their way to the surface, and when they do, the fallout can be devastating. What do you think about this case? Was Daniel a man pushed beyond his limits? Or was he a murderer who chose revenge over reason? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to share where you're watching from. I love seeing people from all around the world engaging with these stories. Thank you for watching Dark Motives. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the shocking cases we uncover every week. Until next time, stay safe. And remember, sometimes the darkest motives come from the people closest to us.